Welcome, Mindigan. Bonjour, Kinawea. Miigwech for joining us. My name is Jesse McCormick. I'm from Deshkan-Ziebing and Donjaba, Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Anishinaabe and Oneida. And glad to be joining you today from the unceded and traditional territory, the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation in Ottawa, Ontario. I am the Senior Vice President, Research, Innovation, and Legal Affairs for the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. And I have the pleasure of welcoming you to this LinkedIn Live presentation titled Canada's Competitive Edge, How Indigenous Nations Are Shaping the Future of Canada's Trade and Market Access. We're looking forward to sharing with you some of the insights from our upcoming conference, Valuing Reconciliation in Global Markets. It will take place in the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, Mississauga Anishinaabe, at the Sheraton Centre Hotel in Toronto from April 27th to 29th. We'll be welcoming industry, government, regulators, speakers, proponents for in-depth discussions around this idea of valuing reconciliation in global markets. And I have the pleasure, along with my colleague Karen Restoul, to be your co-chair for this upcoming event. The First Nations Major Projects Coalition has seen firsthand the impacts of valuing the leadership of Indigenous nations and demonstrating respect for Indigenous rights in business and contributes to successful global and domestic market access, it supports long-term economic growth, and improves environmental sustainability. The integration of Indigenous principles in business is a strategic advantage that benefits Indigenous and commercial interests in highly competitive global markets. These, among many others, will be the topics we discuss when we gather together in Toronto. And today's discussion is a brief introduction to some of those themes and those ideas that we'll be exploring. So we're very pleased to welcome today Jamie Lickers, Senior Vice President of Indigenous Markets at CIBC. Jamie is Onondaga from the Haudenosaunee community of Six Nations of the Grand. She plays a critical role in helping First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities to achieve wellness and financial prosperity. She also has the high-standing distinguished role of having been our 2023 co-host for the FNMPC annual conference, The Values-Driven Economy. And we also welcome Tristan Jackson, Chief Executive Officer of Nikidek. Tristan is a lifelong advocate for sustainability and reducing carbon emissions. He is part of a sovereign wealth fund launched by the FNMPC member North Shore Mi'kmaq Tribal Council in January of 2025. That partnership works with industry partners to develop new real assets focused on clean energy, to engage in joint ventures and create related economic opportunities for the member nations. So I'm very happy to have Tristan and Jamie here to share some of their thoughts, some of their experiences, some of the ideas in the lead up to the upcoming FNMPC conference. So I'll now turn to Jamie first and then Tristan to offer a bit more of a detailed explanation of who they are and the experience and the work that they're bringing to this discussion, following which we'll dive into a bit of a moderated discussion and then some Q&A from the audience. So to you, Jamie.
Great. Thanks, Jesse. It's great to be here with you both today. It's always my honor to join these incredibly informative discussions that the FNMPC organizes. So you sort of hit the high points of who I am and what my role is at the bank. Just in terms of a bit of a background for our audience and a bit of a disclaimer for myself. I'm not a capital markets expert. The team that I manage at CIBC operates primarily in the commercial banking space, as well as in the Indigenous trust and asset management space, although I do work quite closely with our capital markets partners, so can share some commentary and views around those issues, but am by no means the expert. And of course, CIBC is a longstanding supporter of the FNMPC and the great work that your organization has been doing over the last number of years. And we're a proud member of the Sustaining Partners program, which allows us to share our insights and engage in advocacy efforts and efforts with Indigenous communities, specifically from the perspective of a large financial institution in Canada. And I'm very proud to lead this team here at CIBC and lead our partnership with the FNMPC. And like you, Jesse, as you know, I'm a lawyer by trade, not a homegrown banker. A recovering lawyer, I often say, as although I don't know that you ever fully recover from practicing law, but for our audience, you'll see that my legal background often comes into play when we get into some of these issues. So thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Jamie. Over to you, Tristan.
Thank you, Jesse. As you already pointed out, I'm the CEO of Niquidic LP, a new sovereign wealth fund. So in contrast to Jamie's institution or organization that's a large and well-established financial player in the Canadian market, we are very new. This is our first year in operation, but the work to launch the fund started several years ago by the North Shore Mi'kmaq Tribal Council, which also, as you mentioned, is a proud member of the FNMPC, along with its 7 member nations, which are all Mi'kmaq in the northern half of New Brunswick. And the Tribal Council, NSMTC, has existed since 1987 and has grown to an organization of about 85 staff and a $31.5 million annual budget. So it's a substantial organization that had the aspiration of creating economic sovereignty for its own operations and its member bands in New Brunswick. And so I was engaged by the Tribal Council to help to launch this new sovereign wealth fund, which took a lot of upstream work before it was ready to come out and be formally in existence as its own entity, which it now is. And because of all that upstream work, in its first year, we will be breaking ground on projects with our private sector partners with a total installed cost, if everything that we have in play and plan to break ground this year gets built, it'll be about $2.5 billion Canadian dollars worth of new clean infrastructure assets. So a big first start for a small new organization. And that's all to the credit of the work of the Tribal Council, Jim Ward, who's the general manager there, Kevin Woods, who directs the energy services team, and Tyler Paddles, who directs technical services, and others in the organization, as well as the Chiefs and Band Council. So a lot of work has gone into this before it became my honor and opportunity to lead the fund. My background is more in projects than in finance. So we have newly created the fund focused on clean energy, but over the last 12 years, I've worked across every type of technology in the clean energy transition, from grid scale renewables to distributed energy resources, microgrids, energy storage, and most recently nuclear. So I bring a lot of project experience to the role, and we're looking to build on the status and the rights of the communities as rights holders over their traditional territories, to lead on the duty to consult role and the free and informed consent with the communities as partners to private sector developers who are looking to build large-scale wind, solar, transmission and distribution infrastructure, nuclear, energy storage, and other energy transition or critical infrastructure related projects in Atlantic Canada, principally in New Brunswick.
Miigwech. Tristan, we at the First Nations Major Projects Coalition are extremely proud of our members and what they're leading and the work that they're advancing. And it's that collaboration, that bringing together of many like-minded people that really helps to bring power to the coalition and the opportunity to help make the changes that need to be made to ensure that First Nations have access to these opportunities. I have a very pleasant memory of meeting Tristan for, I think it was the first time we went out for Peruvian in Toronto, and he spent a good 2 hours trying his very, very best to explain nuclear fission and saltwater reactors to me, which was very much appreciated and continues to serve me to this day. So thank you again for that, Tristan. So we're going to explore a few key themes. Some of the ideas in the moderated discussion will be de-risking investments through Indigenous participation, scaling localized successes into national strategies, and innovations for equitable partnerships and equity in partnerships as well, I'll add. There will also be an opportunity. We're going to do a few questions. Oh, Tristan,
just sorry to break in. It seems like from the chat there that some people who would like to be viewing are having some technical issues. I don't know if there's anything that you're able to do there, or if we can confirm whether that's just some people or whether all the viewers are not able to get into the webinar yet.
We have the lovely Mel and Keelan, who I am sure will be attentive to that and will help to ensure that these folks are able to join us. But thank you. And Keelan notes that they're checking on the back end. So we'll keep rolling. We'll hope that these folks are able to join us soon. And if not, we tend to post these up online. People will have the chance to view them at a later date if there's anyone who hasn't able to access. In terms of those topics and themes, I'll conduct a bit of a moderated dialogue. I'll ask Jamie some questions. I'll ask Tristan some questions. Feel free to weigh in, contribute as you go. And then as we move a little bit further into the presentation, there'll also be an opportunity for members of the audience to share some questions with us. So there's a comments box, which may vary depending on what platform you're using, but we'll invite you to share your questions if you have any. We'll ensure that we build some time in towards the end for answering those questions as well. So to turn to some of the moderated questions, highlighting Indigenous nations and partnerships and how that's shaping Canada's trade relationships, I think we'll dive into some hard questions for Jamie right off the bat. So given current geopolitical and trade climate, we've got tariffs, we've got changes in availability, we've got demand for critical minerals, all contributing to transition to net zero and the strengthening of the Canadian economy. How are these shifts impacting First Nations who are looking to partner in major projects? As we speak about this in the concept in the space of capital markets, but how are those capital market shifts impacting First Nations?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jesse. And I know that you note that it's a hard question. I hope everyone understands that I don't control the capital markets. And so I'm not responsible for these geopolitical conditions and the challenges that we're seeing today. So don't shoot the messenger, but I'm happy to share with you some insights on that. Obviously, we're facing an unprecedented time in terms of what's happening in the markets from a geopolitical standpoint, as well as from a regulatory standpoint. There have been a number of regulatory changes to the capital markets structure in Canada and how that all functions, but I don't necessarily think that those regulatory changes are particularly of interest to our audience for today's discussion. But I would say that the one area that we're seeing significant change is in rising investor interest in the ESG space, so matters related to environment, social governance issues, in terms of those investors taking a harder look at where their capital is going and the types of activities that they are funding. We've, as you know, in these circles, have lobbied for years for the ESG framework to really incorporate Indigenous values and Indigenous interests. And while there isn't technically an I, it's not ESGI or IESG, Indigenous issues and rights tend to get sort of taken up in that broader ESG framework. And so with that greater investor concern around ESG and I issues, we're seeing a call from investors to ensure that Indigenous participation is captured in a way that de-risks projects. We would have all seen in decades past situations where very good projects were extremely delayed as a result of a complete failure to engage with Indigenous communities in Canada in any meaningful way, which in most cases caused significant delay to projects. It caused political turmoil. It caused escalating costs for those projects. And institutional grade investors are generally not interested in funding projects that have those sorts of uncertainties. It's the uncertainty that creates the risk in those investments. And so we're seeing a much more proactive engagement in the Canadian market right now, where Indigenous interests and partnerships are concerned. And I'm going to borrow some words from our good friend, Mr. Mark Podlasley. Last week, we were together at the Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit in London. And Mark said something that really caught my attention, because I think it summed up the issue quite nicely when he said that equity investment is the purest form of consent. And that is a really impactful statement. So when we make space for Indigenous communities to become equity investors in projects in their territory, or that have the potential to impact their rights and territories, there is no greater level of consent that can be given than that which you would see from an equity investor. So that's creating a greater demand than we've ever seen before for the inclusion of Indigenous participation and ownership in major projects across the country.
Thank you, Jamie. I'll take a moment and acknowledge everyone who's recently joined us through the Facebook link. I understand there were some technical challenges accessing through some of software difficulties integrating Restream, which we're using today, and some of the platforms. So I thank Keelan and Melanie for helping us to navigate that challenge, and welcome all. I'm Jesse McCormick. I'm from the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, joined by Jamie Lickers from CIBC and Tristan Jackson from working out east in, I will make sure, Niquidec, if I've come close there, Tristan, I thank you. A sovereign wealth fund established by the North Shore Mi'kmaq District Council of the FNMPC membership member there. So we're dived into some moderated questions, and I've got one here for Tristan. On the community level, what are you seeing from nations to overcome these challenges in scaling operations? How are they positioning to become global leaders in clean energy innovation development? So from that community level, where the work that you're doing is taking place, how do you envision the idea of having an impact at a global level, and expanding the impact of that work, and ensuring that the value and benefits flow back to the communities?
Yeah, well, there's the saying, nothing about us without us, and about Indigenous populations concerns anything that impacts in any way their traditional hereditary territory, which is the entire country. So that's the starting point, is nothing's going to get done without the inclusion and the involvement of the Indigenous population. And it hasn't always been that way. That's a new, really took hold after the Constitution was restated in 1982. But since then, there's been a growing groundswell of understanding within the communities and within the resource and industry sector that we're not going to get anywhere good or far without First Nations at the table and involved. But going beyond that, what are we working on? How does that specifically apply? How do you do that? Because impact benefit agreements and payments from projects to impacted communities for their allowing things to go forward is better than nothing, but it's not going very far in the right direction. It's a step in the right direction. But the next evolution up from there, as Jamie talked about, was true equity partnership. And that means not just an impact benefit agreement that creates some royalty payment from a project to a community, but a voice and a vote and a seat on the board, an ownership stake. So that's the next level up from there. I believe not just us, I think this is happening across the country, but I know in our case with the North Shore Mi'kmaq Tribal Council and with Niquidec, we're taking it one step further than that to Indigenous leadership in responsible development. And that's switching the order of things from being reactive, where industry wants to come in and get something done, says, look, we understand there's going to be an impact, but there's an upside to that. There's a benefit. We're willing to share that to you. So we'll do the impact benefit agreement, or better than that, we'll invite you to be an equity partner. Now the communities are putting together their own project plans, their own integrated resource planning about how to best make use of the solar real estate, the wind real estate, the biomass, and the minerals and metals, and the use of space for transmission, distribution, transportation, and pipelines, etc. They're developing their own plans and putting that out to industry and to get a response back from who wants to partner, who's going to offer the best terms, and saying, here's some minimum stakes. There's an equity piece is a bare minimum. And we also expect there will be inclusion in supply chain opportunities and in workforce training. But beyond that, who's willing of the private sector that wants to be involved in projects that impact the traditional territories of these communities, who's willing to make the best offer and to be the most proactive partner. So we're working to switch the order of things. And to do that requires some understanding of what's possible and what the market demands. And so to that end, we do a lot of work to build capacity. And that's, I mentioned before, the fund was launched out of the work of an organization that has grown for over 35 years into what it is today, an 85-person substantial, we have some capacity in that organization that was able to then leverage further resources, put in applications for funding and support, and create a sovereign wealth fund. And so having a core of people who have been involved in projects, and every time that we work with developers or with the utility or with the government, and we're looking to support economic growth, we ask for contributions toward capacity development. We create new positions. We put young people coming out of universities on projects as soon as we can get them signed up. So we're always scouting and recruiting to bring more people in and build that capacity within the communities so that then they're able to lead. And again, our best state of the art that we can offer to the world is Indigenous leadership in responsible development, which covers all three of there's a long tradition of environmental stewardship, providing the buy-in, the equity opportunity, the capacity building, and economic reconciliation to the communities. It covers social, and having Indigenous oversight on boards is part of governance. So we're, again, offering those opportunities to investors and to projects and to work with government as a best-in-class version of checking all the boxes on ESG and going beyond through Indigenous leadership and responsible development.
Thank you, Tristan. That idea of providing that leadership is really powerful, and it is creating a path for others to follow and an example for First Nations across the country. To Jamie, they're working in capital markets is one thing. Working in capital markets with First Nations is a different thing. It's a specialized field. It requires a certain amount of knowledge, a certain amount of familiarity, a certain unique dynamic given some of the structural challenges, but also some of the unique opportunities available for First Nations participation in capital markets, and also to secure the financing that First Nations need in order to participate as partners in these major projects. CIBC has recently entered into a partnership with Indigenous-led Longhouse Capital. So wondering if you could reflect a little bit on that unique role of Indigenous peoples in capital markets and tell us a little bit about this new partnership.
Yeah, happy to. We're really proud of this partnership. Fairly new announcement, just announced earlier this month. But for those members of the audience that aren't familiar with Longhouse Capital, Longhouse is an Indigenous-owned alternative asset manager and strategic advisory firm. So quite innovative, quite needed in the marketplace. And their mission is really twofold. One is to produce returns for their investors, to produce what they call superior risk-adjusted returns for investors, but while also making a positive impact in Indigenous communities. So our team at our CIBC Global Asset Management announced this strategic partnership just at the beginning of this month with Longhouse, which really provides CIBC's institutional investors with the ability to expand their private market access and to invest in Indigenous managed alternative investments, including private infrastructure debt, which obviously is a much needed area of investment across Indigenous communities in Canada. So Longhouse in turn uses those investments to finance Indigenous equity investment in that private infrastructure. So we're talking about things like utilities transmission, renewable energy. We're talking about transportation infrastructure and just a whole swath of infrastructure that is much needed in Indigenous communities, but also in large portions of our country that would have been, traditional territory, but not necessarily limited to Indigenous reserve land, for example. So in the North in particular. And we just think that this is really, it's a win-win-win across the board. It's more than a win-win. It's definitely a win for clients, for institutional clients at CIBC that are looking for these kinds of opportunities. And I think there's a growing demand, particularly given the turmoil in mainstream markets at the moment. Capital is looking for new and innovative homes at the moment. So it's a win for clients. I think it's a win for our partners at Longhouse, who are just creating a new avenue for investors to invest in Indigenous communities in a way that is largely de-risked. And it's a win for Indigenous communities. So it's a win-win-win in our books, and we're really excited about this partnership. Obviously, the team at Longhouse is, we believe in what they're doing. We think that they're the right people to do it. Fred and his team over there, we're really looking forward to the partnership.
Oh, that's fantastic news. Congratulations to CIBC and Longhouse on this partnership. Fred is a bundle of energy and enthusiasm for helping to create opportunities for First Nations and economic development. So he brings a lot of value to the room, and I'm excited to see what you guys accomplish as you move forward in this partnership and work. I would invite anyone who's interested and has a question to feed it into the comments box and share it with us. We'll be getting to those soon. In terms of Nikwayodek, Tristan, one of the things that I've come to learn in my time with the First Nations Major Projects Coalition is there's a lot of education that needs to take place when you're talking across the table, whether it's to proponents, whether it's to capital investors or governments. It's something that your executive director, Jim Ward at the North Shore Mi'kmaq District Council does quite well, but to be that voice to help fill some of those gaps in understanding and experience so that there's an opportunity to create mutually beneficial partnerships. And that begins with mutual understanding. How is the Sovereign Wealth Fund conducting that work? How are you looking to build the partnerships, and is education part of that work in terms of creating the partnerships that you need to bring the value back to the communities?
Absolutely, and great point, great question. It builds on the last part of my answer to the previous question about capacity building. And I mentioned then that when we enter into agreements with partners or when we work with the government, we always put in an item in the budget that addresses capacity building. And Nikwayodek LP is currently in a sort of incubation stage, if you will, under the North Shore Mi'kmaq Tribal Council. So it will be a fully standalone and for-profit fund eventually. In its first year, not having any kind of previous business existence to build out of, we were able to launch with the support of ACOA and RDC, the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, and the Regional Development Corp at the federal and provincial levels, respectively. So we're grant supported in the launch of the fund, and in our application we included education of the board members, the chiefs, the band councils, and the staff of North Shore Mi'kmaq Tribal Council. So we have kind of inward facing to the communities an education budget. We're bringing in outside experts, and we're making the space and going away from the regular day job for 2 and 3 day retreats where we can focus on what does it mean to own and to run a sovereign wealth fund as Indigenous communities, and what are the opportunities, what are the risks, and how do we navigate that, how do we make it the best that it can be. That, again, I guess it's inward facing. There's also the outward piece, and this opportunity to speak with people beyond our communities is one example of that. I was also at a conference yesterday in Halifax, so we do a lot of speaking publicly at conferences and at events like this to share what we're doing and the philosophy behind it, what specific opportunities are, what are the general values, the guiding principles. And so we do outward-facing education publicly whenever we get the chance, whenever invited. We'd like to show up and join the conversation. And with our partners, we make time. There's a saying among Indigenous communities that I really love takes about 500 cups of tea to build a relationship. And we'll repeat that often, and we'll embody it. Go out and not just talk about the project, but sit down and get to know each other as people. And that it's bi-directional. We need to understand and bring in learning and skills from the partners who have expertise around projects and technologies, and we need to share outward to them in a broadcast setting like this, and in individual around the cup of tea, tables, lunches, like the dinner, Jesse, that you mentioned that you and I had a Peruvian meal and a long conversation to get into some of the specifics of what we're working on and how we're doing it in the advanced reactor space. So we'll have, as you saw then, we'll make the time to go where people are, put ourselves out there, and we'll invite them into communities to come to the powwows, to come to the band councils, and to make presentations. We also do the same with government. So there's a fair portion, not just of the budget that we ask for around projects, but like here and now, we're on this call on our own time. We'll look for every opportunity to have the conversation, hear from people, hear what their questions are, and tell them about ourselves.
That's fantastic. We can't emphasize enough how important building those partnerships are. And that can take the time. It can take the 5 cups of tea. It can sometimes take 10 cups of tea. It is the foundation upon which you can conduct the work necessary to establish the formal commercial relationships that will create the opportunities that are going to be the strength in project development, the acceleration of the regulatory processes, the investor confidence that really needs to go into developing projects in Canada today. I would highlight one thing, and Jamie mentioned a couple of things in terms of participation, or maybe it was Tristan in relation to electricity, grid-related projects. One element of the FNMPC conference that I'm very excited about is on day 2, we'll be announcing or launching an Indigenous utilities paper. We've taken some time to meet with tribal utilities in the States and connect with some utilities, Indigenous-led utilities in Canada, to explore what are the barriers and what are the opportunities for Indigenous-led utilities in Canada? What changes need to be made? And what does that mean for First Nations that really want to harness the opportunity, both act as regulators in some sense, but also to participate in a more wholesome way in some of the potential that being part of the electricity system has to offer. So we're looking at those kind of opportunities as part of the thought leadership of the FNMPC. And we're very grateful to everyone who shared their time with us. And I acknowledge the work of my colleagues, Dr. Sue Vanderpoorten and Barry Vickers, in helping to shape this. And we're very excited to share it with you at the conference as well. There is a question in the chat from Alex Bishop. I'm going to bring it back a little bit to a bit of a higher level. She's asking about some of the evaluation that takes place. And Jamie, I think this one's for you in terms of, as someone who's navigating capital markets and understanding the negative impact that risk can have on investments. What types of metrics are being applied by banks, proponents, and others to evaluate whether this is a project or an initiative they should invest in? What types of things are they looking for, specifically in terms of relationships with Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Obviously, all banks are in the business of taking measured risk. Our lending is done with a view to ensuring that we're comfortable with the level of risk for any given project. And so there are quite complex metrics that are applied to that, as you can imagine. But from a general sense, if we're taking a 10,000 foot view, there are a couple of key pieces of advice that I always give to our Indigenous clients. One is on the governance side of things. Good governance is something that you really can't place a dollar value on. You either have it or you don't. And when you're asking a lender, and we come to view ourselves as a partner in your transaction, in your project, as the lender, we become partners to whatever it is that you're looking to access capital to fund. And we need to have a certain level of comfort in the governance of the organization, of our borrower. And also, we need to have a certain level of comfort with regard to your financial management. So very basic things like producing timely audited financial statements. is just critical to engage in this space when you're looking for support and equity investment into these projects. Those are two, I'm not going to say they're easy, because they're not easy. There are so many elements to fostering good governance, good financial management, but they're really critical. And it's critical that those controls, those processes be put in place as soon as possible, because the practice of being in good governance, the practice of having good financial management is something that grows with an organization. And when you sacrifice those elements because you become busy, because you're overwhelmed, because your operations are growing, it becomes harder to implement those key principles as you get busier, as you grow. So we really advocate for good governance, good financial management at the very early stages for any entity, not just Indigenous, but it provides both your lenders and your investors with a base level of comfort that allows you to start building that relationship that you're going to need in order to get that support from your partners.
Thank you, Jamie. That's very insightful and very helpful. And I think it speaks to, there are some First Nations that have been able to establish really strong governance frameworks with Indigenous or First Nation economic development corporations, and others that are still in the process of setting those things up. And building that capacity is a really important part of strengthening Canada's capacity to build effectively and build on an accelerated basis. So capacity is something that we often emphasize in our work at the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, and it's something that you see reverberate through the achievements of our members, but also through the lenders and analysis from friends at places like the CIBC. In terms of, Tristan, in terms of some of the work that we do, there's always a concern from First Nations about consultation and accommodation, engagements being a checkbox exercisers. We will, if you get the chance to join us at the conference, you'll see a video where we refer to tickety box. The idea that you're spending your time, you're spending your energy, you're focused, you're bringing your capacity to dialogues, and the other side of the table is looking to check a box. So that when they turn around to government, to the Crown, they can say, we've talked, we've had our discussions, we've engaged, we've consulted. How do we get past that idea of those engagements and discussions being just a legal checkbox and move to a spot where the other side of the table, I'm sitting on the First Nation side of the table, but the other side of the table sees that partnership as a source of competitive advantage, really harnesses that reconciliation value that we're talking about at this upcoming conference, valuing reconciliation in global markets. How do we help to impart that understanding in the partners that are working across the different First Nations?
That's a great question, and I guess on the sort of more cynical side, I would say not everyone's going to get it, and that's not ideal. Maybe it'd be great if everybody could understand and come around and really take advantage of the opportunity that there is in partnering with Indigenous leadership and populations. But I don't know that everyone will get it. And some will always see it as, this is a nuisance, this is an obligation, and maybe I've got duty to consult. Okay, how do I get it over with and move on with what I want to do? I think that over time, the market is going to act and do what it does, and weed out the people who don't approach it with the right attitude. Because again, as we spoke about a little bit earlier just now, the Indigenous populations and leaders are really waking up to the rights that they do hold, and the amount of need and demand that there is in the world for access to resources and to space to site energy projects, and that they're in a very good position to negotiate. And so in our case, we are getting called often. Almost weekly, we'll hear from someone that we don't already know, looking for how do we get access to the opportunity that there is where your communities are going to hold rights over an effective veto power over whether or not a project can go forward. How do we get in there? And we tell everybody, if you're really interested in a deep, long-term, collaborative relationship, come on out, come sit down, come have the 500 cups of tea, come talk with us. Because we'd love to see how big we could grow this together. And incidentally, we may have a project that you can focus on right now. We may not. The people always want to know, if you've mentioned $2.5 billion worth of projects starting this year, how can we get in on that? Well, those teams are already full. The capital stack's already full. If you wanted to be in on those, you had to talk to us 2 or 3 years ago. And if you want to be on the projects that are coming, which are going to continue to scale up in order of magnitude every few years, I would expect, and that's the plan. If you want to be in on that, then don't wait until the project has been announced. You've got to start now. And that, again, we believe that the market will speak and the numbers will speak. The success of the projects that are Indigenous led, or where the private sector proponent has done really well on inclusion and on true partnership, they're not going to run into some of the obstacles. And a lot of good projects, economically good projects, have not happened in Canada because that box to check was approached as a box to check, and it wasn't seen as an opportunity to build a relationship. A plan came in kind of fully baked from outside of a community, and a developer said, I want to build this here. Plan's already worked out, and we know what we want to do. That just doesn't end well, and Indigenous populations are learning they don't have to just accept that. They want a partner who has come in and gotten to know them, who has given them an opportunity to shape the project and to really have input on the process when it's still in the concept phase. And the projects that do that, they make it all the way through. It maybe takes a little more time up front, but it's a slow is smooth and smooth is fast situation. The people that invest in the relationship don't hit those snags later, and they end up, the projects are more successful, less is spent on them, fewer things go wrong. And I think ultimately those are the ones, and the companies that pursue the relationship that way are the ones that are going to win in the market.
Well, thank you, Tristan. So for anyone in the audience, we'll be wrapping up fairly soon. So if you have any questions you want to get in, do post them. I do. So the road to partnership hasn't always been easy. First Nations inclusion that road's been paved with direct action, with protests, with litigation, with a lot of energy and time being focused more on creating space for First Nations participation and advancing the partnerships that should be there. So we've managed to make some really significant progress. The First Nations Major Projects Coalition was particularly proud of some of our contributions to the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program that was announced in the 2024 federal budget, which provided a $5 billion backstop to help First Nations participate in major project development to help address challenges like, in many cases, First Nations lack access to a deep balance sheet or can't collateralize assets because of the impacts of the Indian Act. So we've made some progress, and that fund we were very happy to see was recently doubled, a commitment by Prime Minister Carney prior to the writ dropping for the election to double that as an investment on the part of the government of Canada. So seeing some really positive things happening there. But there are still many challenges, still many structural challenges that First Nations confront as they seek to advance, and capacity is one of those challenges. But Jamie, in terms of your experience, and perhaps imagine we were speaking to folks that haven't had the opportunity to navigate these types of partnerships or these types of opportunities with First Nations, what types of structural challenges are still out there that make investing something that really requires a unique approach and a commitment to problem solving?
Yeah. I'd like to think that groundbreaking fireside chat that I hosted with Mark Carney at last year's conference may have played a small role in his commitment to double the federal fund for those guarantees. And it's a welcome move by the federal government. Look, it's capital for equity investment is the most difficult capital to access. And that's not just in the Indigenous context. That's just true in every context. If you think, for those who might not be banking experts or knowledgeable in the capital market space, I mean, if you think of it's fairly akin to the situation with obtaining a mortgage. Right. There's a certain level of down payment which is equity, right? There's an equity contribution that is required from the purchaser. It's impossible to get a mortgage for 100% of the value of the purchase price of a home in Canada under our banking system. Um, and there's a number of reasons for that, a number of very good reasons for that. But so if you think of it in that context, it starts to make a bit more sense to people. The value of assets, the value of investments, they fluctuate. The markets fluctuate. We know that. The last couple of weeks, there's been no better demonstration of market fluctuations and the possibilities that geopolitical tensions can have on things like the markets. And so there has to be some skin in the game from the purchaser. You can't 100% finance any project. And that equity capital, that investment from your owners of a project or a company or a homeowner, that's the most difficult capital to secure. And it's no different in the Indigenous context, hence the need for provincial and federal loan guarantee programs, because, well, it's not unique to the Indigenous space, the difficulty in securing equity capital. What is unique in the Indigenous space is the limitations that are imposed on Indigenous communities by things like the Indian Act. And this is when the lawyer in me comes out, and we just have to recognize the systemic limitations that prevent Indigenous people, for the most part, if we're talking about status Indians and First Nations, from using, in most cases, their most valuable assets as security for lending, right? If we go back to that mortgage example, most people obtain a mortgage because they can pledge the home that they're purchasing as the collateral for that mortgage. How many people could obtain a $500,000 or $800,000 or $1 million mortgage if they couldn't pledge the home as security? Very few. And that's the position that First Nations are in Canada when they're trying to participate in the economy at all levels, everything from mortgages to equity investments for major projects. So those limitations can't be ignored. The loan guarantee programs, they're a step in the right direction of addressing these challenges in an attempt to level that playing field, but there are challenges.
To reflect on what you shared earlier, the comments from our Chief Executive Officer, Mark Podlasly, that equity is the purest form of free, prior, and informed consent, but to recognize those challenges still persist. And one of the powerful elements of building these types of partnerships is it's no longer First Nations working in isolation, trying to make these systemic changes that will empower the growth of the Canadian economy. It is First Nations in partnership with others, with businesses, with industry, with various sectors, all calling for the types of changes that need to happen so that we can build those economic partnerships that are going to help power the Canadian economy. Tristan, I'd like to take you to one of the questions we've received from Ryan in the comment boxes. Ryan's asked, how can co-investment models between First Nations and institutional investors be scaled to meet Canada's growing infrastructure needs?
That's a great question, and actually builds a little on some of Jamie's comments about how hard it is to secure that first equity, the cash that an individual or an organization has to have on hand to get started. And as Jamie also noted, there are property issues around title that prevent First Nations from being able to leverage their homes and lands as collateral for loans. So we're fortunate in the case of Niguitic to have a decent little charge of dry powder saved up through very patient and diligent fiscal management of the North Shore Mi'kmaq Tribal Council. So we have a bit of cash that we're working with. And that's so important to be able to put into the early stages of development so that a project can go from an idea to having some substance that then can be built on and can invite in other capital partners. I want to tie this into another question that showed up in the chat about whether we're doing co-investment with family offices. So whether family offices or institutional investors or other sources of capital, banks, everyone has their preferred point in the project life cycle and their risk to return appetite. A bank likes to come in when it's bankable. So, and a whole lot has already happened, or at least a fair amount has already happened. And an institutional investor tends to come maybe before the bank, but after the first stage of development has been done. So how can it be scaled? Well, we need to work with the different capital partners and investors across the project lifecycle. And regarding family offices, they might make a smaller play. They might put in $250,000, $500,000, a few million. But they might be willing to do that at the front end of the project. And that's where it can create the highest return. And it's the most valuable for us to have a charge of cash in hand to be able to start the projects moving along toward bankable. Where then when it comes time to build something, the projects we're talking about, I don't think we've got any that are smaller than about $250 million. So these are sizable projects. But 80+% of that total project cost is going to come in the form of a bank loan. We just need to get it to the point where we have the signed offtake agreements and the site control and a bit of pre-feed work on the engineering and design has been done. And that we need more flexible equity partners. Family offices are great at the front end, and we're actually in the process now of raising a $10 million early stage development fund that family offices and other early risk capital could come into. To scale and meet the needs of the energy transition and meet the opportunity that we have really right in front of us to grow the Canadian economy, we need more of that early stage capital to come in and to take limited partner positions on funds that are led by First Nations, to do that Indigenous-led responsible development that I mentioned earlier. And we invest that money into the paper side of it, getting the legal agreements in place on offtake agreements, site control, licensing, permitting. And once a project approaches bankable, then we can take it to the larger institutional investors. They can come in for an equity piece around a bankable project, and we can match that with loans from CIBC and CIB and build up the rest of the capital stack that way. But it's really key that we get more of the risk capital to come in on the front end. And we have some cash in the case of Niguitic that we're working with. Many First Nations have been able to save up some, and many have not. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for more flexible. Again, family offices are a great source of this, but that smaller, more impact oriented and willing to take higher risk kind of capital to come in that equity position at the front end. I think that'll help unlock the scale that we need to see and to get the pipeline of projects flowing, where then the bigger institutional investors and then the banks can follow.
That's fantastic. Well, I think based on today's discussion and what you've shared, I think we can all be cautious optimists. We can see a better future and many good things laying out in front of us. I'd like to take a moment and switch gears a little bit and reflect on some of the opportunities that you'll see if you're able to join us for the FNMPC annual conference, Valuing Reconciliation in Global Markets. Just to give you some examples of the things we'll be discussing. We'll have the CEO from CN Rail. We'll be hearing from them on some of their work in terms of building relationships with First Nations across the country. We've invited and looking forward to welcoming representatives from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, Wabigoon Ojibwe Nation, to discuss how they've managed to discuss and bring together ideas and hopefully chart a path forward in relation to management of nuclear waste and the development of a deep geological repository. We'll be exploring themes in relation to moving financing into First Nations communities and some of the experiences from Alaskan Native corporations. Also, very excited to welcome former Prime Minister Stephen Harper to reflect on some of his knowledge and experience working in this area. So we've got a very busy and exciting lineup of people that we'll be hearing from in Toronto. And Tristan and Jamie, as we move to a close here, I'd love to invite you to share briefly any last thoughts you might want to share with the audience, but also to reflect on anything that any reflections on the FNMPC conference. been something that you've enjoyed in the past? Is it something that you're looking forward to in the future? Is there anything specific that you've had in your experiences attending this event? And
Yeah,
looking
maybe
to
I'll just jump
Jamie first, do my
in.
moderator work. There we go.
Ladies first. Look, I have found in the relatively short history of the existence of the FNMPC that your organization has just moved the dial on this discussion so dramatically in such a short period of time, and accomplished things that were talked about as concepts for decades, like a federal Indigenous loan guarantee program. Right. And I think we would be remiss not to acknowledge our late friend and colleague and the leader of the FNMPC, Nilo Edwards, who just dedicated his life's work to advancing these issues, to trying to solve some of these problems, to foster true partnership, to bring together industry leaders in a collaborative way to tackle these challenges. And he was the kind of person who brought people together and built those relationships. And look where we've come as a result in the very short history of the existence of the FNMPC. And now I think we have to be motivated to continue on this good work in the name of his legacy, and to find a renewed energy and commitment and hope for what the future can look like when we all come together to work on these issues. And so I'm really looking forward to the event, as always.
Thank you, Jamie. And I'll share those reflections on Nilo. Nilo is our founding CEO. Nilo tragically passed in December 2024. We were very sad to lose him, and we feel that loss every day. He equipped us with the tools we need to continue to do the good work he helped us start. But to everyone who's reached out, who shared their views, who've passed along condolences, we express our appreciation to you, because it has been very meaningful for us, and we are doing our best to continue to build on his legacy. Tristan, any last thoughts, any reflections on the upcoming conference?
Yeah, something that I've been saying for a long time about the energy transition. First of all, it's bigger than, I think we get a little hung up on decarbonization, which is necessary but far from sufficient. There's a whole lot more to do beyond cleaner energy, which, again, we have to do that to have a survivable and a thriving future. But we also need to lift billions of people still out of energy poverty around the world. And even at home in Canada, there are challenges with availability and affordability of energy. So there's so much to do beyond decarbonization, which itself is a huge task. The scale of it is such that there's more than enough to go around. There's no need to be protectionist or to think territorially about opportunities. And it happens. We see people being sort of sharp-elbowed and I think viewing opportunities as there's a fixed or a scarce pie that if their piece isn't bigger, then they're going to miss something that where they need to compete with other peers and companies, communities, to defend their piece of something that's limited. And I just don't see the limit. The scale is so huge. There's so much to be done, which means there's a tremendous amount of value to be created. And I'm firm in the belief that there's more than enough to go around. On the upside, that's a good thing. On the downside, or where's the risk? It's going to take all of us working together in a new way. And if we don't become very focused, very collaborative, and invite a lot more partnership and participation and inclusivity into the space, we're not going to have the speed and the scale and the workforce and the capital that we need. It's really something that's going to take us all pulling together. And how do you make that happen? Well, you need to get out there in person, a face-to-face and a handshake and a sit-down for a coffee or a meal at a Peruvian restaurant. It does so much more than a webinar can. And the conferences are such great opportunities to get that in-person connection. Can't say enough about it, the need and the value in getting out there in person, meeting people face to face, and starting to build those partnerships, have the 500 cups of tea and beyond, and start with the relationship, getting to know the other person and understand their interests and what they're bringing to the table. Seek more, to understand and to be understood. But make the time and get out to the conference, join the FNMPC or the other organizations, and there's a number of them. There's room for everyone at the table, and it's going to take all of us together working on these issues. So I'm really happy, that the North Shore Mi'kmaq Tribal Council has been a member of FNMPC the years that it has, and I just see us doing more together in the future, and hopefully inviting a lot more partners and the people that are listening in on this webinar to come and join this work together.
What a fantastic way to conclude our discussions. We thank, as always, our sponsors, our sustaining partners for helping us to advance this work. As you've heard today, First Nations participation, real, meaningful, effective participation, is helping to create new opportunities for trade and market access for all of Canada. And that's good for this country as a whole. I'd like to thank Jamie and Tristan for their time, their thoughtfulness, their energy, their positivity. I'd also like to thank Mel and Keelan from Sedgwick Strategies for helping us out on the back end and helping to bring everyone together. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you for your interest in this work. It's your support, it's your interest that helps us to move things forward. We look forward to and we invite you to attend the FNMPC Valuing Reconciliation and Global Markets Conference taking place at the Sheridan Centre Hotel in Toronto on April 27th to 29th. There are still tickets available. It will be an exciting, engaging, and energy-consuming dialogue, and that you will not regret if you can come to join us there. So come join us, sit down with leaders, investors, First Nations, regulators, to discuss how we can build stronger relations and strengthen the Canadian economy. We would love to see you there. Thank you for joining us today. Miigwech.